Hello and welcome to another episode 2 of Series 1 of the Profoundly Silly Wisdom podcast. The podcast for women who are ready to start living as their authentic self rather than following the shoulds. Now today's message is actually about imposter syndrome. I want to cover what imposter syndrome is, and it's not just a lack of confidence. Why it's so difficult to shake, and also 2 keys to help you overcome imposter syndrome for good. And stay till the end if you can, because that's the most important key of all. So what is imposter syndrome? Well, it's that unfounded feeling that you're not good enough. And I say unfounded because actually a lot of people who experience really strong imposter syndrome are high achievers. So it's people who are actually, who are talented. So it's not actually an issue of not being talented or good enough, but it's just that feeling that you're not good enough, and that belief that you're not good enough. You may doubt your abilities or expertise, and find yourself, working twice as hard just to keep your performance level up, because you sort of fear it's slipping and then everybody will see that you're not really meant to be here. It's that kind of feeling. You feel like a fraud, like you're wearing a mask, and basically you are masking your insecurities. So it can happen in all kinds of scenarios. It can happen in relationships, it often happens in the workplace, any kind of social setting. But the common denominator is this fear of being exposed and ridiculed or rejected by others. So it's actually a really horrible feeling. And I know, because I experienced a lot of it in my working life. And there's lots of things we try to do to fix it, like tools we use, like maybe self-hypnosis, affirmations, certain power postures and things, and all kinds of things, and they can sort of help, but they often only bring temporary relief. So why is imposter syndrome so difficult to shake? Well, I think the reason for this is that we spend all of our time focusing on the lack of confidence aspect, and actually really that's just a symptom of a deeper root cause. So what is the root cause of imposter syndrome? Well, before I share that with you, let me tell you a story. So today's story is The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen, a very famous story. So I want you to picture a barnyard and a mother duck hatching some eggs. So she's hatching these cute yellow ducklings. The last one takes a lot longer to hatch, and she sort of gets quite frustrated at how long it's taking, and eventually it hatches. But instead of being this yellow cute little duckling, it's a grey bird, and it's significantly larger than the other birds. And so what happens is the animals in the barnyard pick on this grey bird because he's so different, and they call him ugly, hence the ugly duckling. Now the abuse gets so bad that he actually runs away from the barnyard. He goes to live with some wild ducks and geese, but the ducks and geese get killed by hunters, so he then has to find somewhere else to live. He manages to find a home with an old lady, but unfortunately her cat and her hen tease the duckling because he can't purr like a cat, so what's that about? And he can't lay eggs, so what use is he basically in their eyes? So he basically runs away again, and the story is really this cycle of rejection and running away. It's quite sad actually, because it continues until he gets to the point where he's so low that he wants to commit suicide. But even before he gets to that point, he's taken in by a peasant. The peasant takes him home to his family, and the children run up to him because they want to play with him, but he interprets that as being attacked, because that's all he's ever known, so he runs away. So unfortunately he runs away from help. So he's now got to the point where he's he's had enough. He's lived his whole life in this feeling of rejection and not belonging, and so he decides to commit suicide by throwing himself in front of a flock of swans. But what happens? To his great surprise, the swans don't actually attack him. They actually welcome him into their company, which is, the first time he's had that experience. And it's at this point that he sees his reflection in the stream, where they're all standing, and he realizes that he's actually not the duckling he thought he was. He sees that he is a swan, and so the story ends with him discovering that he's actually a swan and flying off with this flock of swans, his newfound family. So how does this story relate to imposter syndrome, and more importantly, how does it relate to your life? And this is the key to why imposter syndrome is so difficult to shake, because it's not, like I said before, the lack of confidence. It's actually an identity issue. So like the ugly duckling in the story, it usually results from being brought up in an environment where you didn't feel accepted as you are. Now, you may have been actively taunted, or you may just have felt, that you were different from the others in your environment, and it sort of sowed that seed of insecurity into you. And so now, you feel like you can't share your gifts with others. They either might be ridiculed or they're just not recognized, and there's this feeling of having to sort of pretend to be like everyone else just so that you fit in, otherwise you'll be rejected like the poor ugly duckling, and have to fend for yourself. So in our lives, how does this work out? Well, we end up in situations where we, work situations, we might downplay our gifts so that we fit in, or we feel that we have to work extra hard to look like everybody else, to do it the way everybody else is doing it. Believe me, if you set up a YouTube channel, you'll experience some of that. You have to decide, no, I'm going to be me and not try and do it like everyone else, because people are, in every endeavour of life, in your workplace or wherever you may be experiencing this, there are people who are performing well, but it's about actually performing as yourself, not trying to be someone else. So if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, it's actually a possible clue that you're living out of alignment with your true nature. You've kind of assumed this false identity, and in order to try and fit in, and it's kind of a programmed identity, because that's what you learned growing up. Oh, I've got to be like this or do this in order to be a good person or a successful person, and basically in order to be accepted, because that's what it fundamentally comes down to. So that's why we do it, and it's understandable as well, because from an evolutionary point of view, the biggest fear that any human or any animal has is being rejected by the group, because if you think about our evolutionary past, that meant being shunned and left alone. So you either get killed by other tribes, or you get left alone and have to fend off wild animals, and you've got no one to help you, or just even the elements. So there's a reason we have this deep-rooted fear of rejection. But the problem is, when we are living out of this programmed identity, we're actually going against the flow of our own creative energy. So it just feels jarring, which is why it creates such an uncomfortable feeling. And also it diminishes our power, because a big part of our energy is going on keeping up this appearance to please and appease other people. But also, not only that, because it's kind of rooted in our past, in our upbringing, well, our evolutionary past, but also more recently our upbringing, we're basically diverting a lot of energy to the past as well. So there's a lot of our energy that is focused on trying to maintain the scenario, maintain the veneer. And that's all energy that is not going into you living your life, and sharing your talents in your unique way. So yeah, that's the down low on this dreadful imposter syndrome. So basically on a subconscious level, there's part of us, our inner child, if you like, is still trying to gain the approval from our parents or guardians. So even if you're in a situation, like a work situation where you feel like you're having to keep the appearance up and you're performing hard, well, you think, well, I'm not thinking about my parents in that scenario. But what is happening at the subconscious level is that the authority figures become your parents. And so you're projecting that scenario onto this scenario. You're projecting that kind of, I've got to please the authority figure in order to be safe. So it's basically what you keep doing until you've kind of healed or integrated your inner child. So you may be in a relationship or doing a job that isn't a good match, and you're maybe doing this. You might be conscious, I'm doing this to please my family. So you may already be aware of that, or you might just be projecting that sort of unfinished business, if you like, onto this other situation, onto your partner. If you're in a relationship where you feel you're not able to be yourself, you're kind of having to pretend to be someone you're not to keep this person from rejecting you. But yeah, for example, in a work scenario, you could be in a situation where you're going against your nature. So maybe you feel you have to hustle, you have to go out, get business, beat people over the head, sales, but in that really aggressive way. And actually your nature is more gentle. You might prefer to, focus more on what it is you're building, and do more, resonant marketing that sort of brings people to you, instead of you having to like go out and fight to get business. And you might, again, on that fighting note, you might feel like you're competing with colleagues or competing with other companies in the industry, or you have to fight to maintain your success. You've gone through all of this effort to be successful, and now you have to fight to maintain it. So that's an example where you could be out of alignment with your true identity. I mean, that's certainly how I felt being in the corporate world a lot of the time. And also sharing your success with your family, rather than sort of feeling like you have to keep hold of it and stop anyone else from getting any. So that's an example that maybe you're experiencing yourself. So why do we do this to ourselves? Well, it may be because, like the ugly duckling, that you just haven't yet really become fully aware of your true nature, what it is, what your values are, what is aligned for you. Or it might be that you just haven't yet given yourself permission to be yourself, perhaps because you still don't feel safe. You might think, I know who I am, but I can't be myself in this environment, it's not safe. So those are the two sort of aspects to that question. So that's where the two keys come in, the two keys to overcoming imposter syndrome rather than just treating the symptoms. So the first key is know yourself. And I'd say start with your values. Now, why do your values matter? Well, your values tell you, they point to your true identity, to your authentic self. And they help you to then make aligned life choices rather than just deferring to the opinions of others. If you're not aware of your values, it's so easy to get swayed by the opinions, especially if they're strong opinions around you. And that's how you can sort of get off course in terms of your own, living an aligned sort of authentic life. So how do you get clear on your values? Well, sometimes it's easier to start with what's not working. So for example, if you're in that work situation where you're experiencing imposter syndrome, you might decide to make a list of all of the things that are bothering you and just put everything down, list everything. But when you've made that list, and it could be across things like, the company culture, your boss, your colleagues, your work tasks, your work conditions, those kinds of things. But when you've done that list, next to each item on the list, make a note of whether it's a preference or an actual value. So for example, if I put on my list the coffee sucks, that's obviously a preference because it shows that I prefer good quality coffee. Why wouldn't you, of course? So that's an example of a preference. But a value could be something like, the boss shouts at me and my colleagues in front of everyone, and that's basically, for me, for example, that could be infringing the value of kindness or respect. You can put down whatever the value is that you feel is being infringed in that situation. So when you've got that, you've got a whole list of things that really matter to you. And by focusing on the values, it's not that you ignore the preferences. It's useful to know what your preferences are, but the values are the things are what causes that real deep sort of sense of not being aligned, which is at the root of imposter syndrome. So that's where the bang for the buck is, in terms of overcoming this condition. So that brings us on to key number 2. Are you ready to give yourself permission to be your authentic self? You may have realised that you're doing things that aren't aligned for you, that don't feel in alignment with your true nature. Or maybe there's stuff you're not doing in order to seek approval from others because you want to fit in. You don't want to rock the boat or do something that they might consider inappropriate. So if you've familiarised yourself with your values, you've already made a good start. But now it comes down to, are you ready to meet and accept your inner swan? In Celtic lore, the swan symbolises soul, love and beauty. And I've got here, I've got a card from the Druid Animal Oracle deck. I hope you can see it properly. And that's what it feels like, soulful, loving, beautiful, when we're actually in the presence of someone who is their authentic self. Think of someone who you might know them personally, or you might just know of them, who you think of as truly authentic. There's something about the energy of being truly authentic. It's kind of relaxing and energizing at the same time. I think it's relaxing because you know that they're not wearing a mask, they don't have a hidden agenda, but it's also energizing because there's a flow there that just feels good to be around. And that's what happens when you start to flow in your authentic nature, rather than trying to, be like everybody else or do it like everybody else. Because sometimes it's not just about the thing itself, it's just doing it in your own way. So it's not necessarily that you need to upend your whole life and stop doing all the things you've been doing, but it may be that you just haven't connected to those tasks in a way that flows for you. So this seems like a good point to go back to the ugly duckling story, because it actually really illustrates the ways in which we reject rather than accept ourselves. So for example, I'm just reading the list here. The ugly duckling is the wrong colour. Anyone ever judge anyone else for being the wrong colour? Probably don't need to say much more about that one. He's the wrong size. Or another one, in this case he's too big, but you could be too big, you could be too small and not built enough, There's so many different ways. And again, he supposedly lacks the skills of the other animals. He can't purr like the cat, he can't lay eggs like the hen, so he's clearly pointless. His existence is pointless because he can't do those things. And it's his belief that he's a duckling rather than a swan that leads him to avoid other animals, because he feels like he's failing. He's a failing duck, basically. And therefore believes everyone's going to reject him for his failure. But unfortunately it means he ends up rejecting those that are there to help him. But even in all of this, you know, despite the sadness of the story, his intuition is still speaking to him. There's a point in the story which I didn't have time to mention, that he sees a flock of swans and his heart stirs within him. And this is before he has the realization of his true nature. He just sees them flying in the sky, and he just, again, it's like he's seeing them in their authentic nature. And that just calls to him, and he wants to go and join them, but hasn't yet developed his ability to fly, because he's still, you know, he's still a cygnet, a baby swan. So, you know, he's not able to act on it just at that point. But that intuition is giving him a clue about his true nature. And it's the same with us, you know, our intuition, those moments of inspiration, if you like, will point to your true north. They will point to your true nature. So whatever stories or excuses you've made for not accepting and celebrating who you are, the moral of this story is that the real you is beautiful, loving and magnificent. And, you know, look out for those moments of inspiration, because that is actually your intuition calling to you and pointing you towards your authentic self. So that's another thing to do. Make a note of those moments where you feel inspired. You know, you're watching somebody in their flow, and it may be, like I said before, it may be the thing itself that you think, oh, I want to do that, you know, oh, I'd love to do that. Or it may be just the act of watching someone flowing in their true nature. But look out for those moments, because there's gold in there. It's pointing to your authentic self. So I hope you've been able to see by now that imposter syndrome isn't really so much a confidence issue as a case of mistaken identity. You know, it's about a magnificent swan that believes it's an ugly duck. And if you think about it, in the story, he's too big. And that's exactly what happens in our lives. You know, we get, you know, our true nature is too big and too radiant, and therefore we get taught to play small in order to fit in and not rock the boat. But I'm hoping now that you understand that there is actually nothing wrong with you, and so you can start that process of embracing who you truly are and actually taking flight. If you found today's video helpful, please like it, as that gets the message out to other people who might need it. And if you know someone who definitely needs it, then please share this message with them. And of course, if you want to join the movement of people who are listening to that call to authenticity, then also subscribe to the Profoundly Silly Wisdom channel, as I'll be, you know, sharing more on that theme and hopefully building a community around that movement. And one last reminder, because I can't resist it: remember who you really are, and see you on the other side.